Alyssa Monroe always had a world inside her that overflowed with colors and shapes since she was 5 years old. When her mother gave her her first set of colored pencils, she would transform any piece of paper into her own universe. In the small wooden house where she grew up, the walls of her room were covered with drawings, imaginary landscapes, faces of people she observed at the bus stop, animals she had never seen in person, the daughter of a cleaning lady and a factory worker who worked alternating shifts. Alyssa grew up watching her parents come home exhausted. Money was never abundant. Sometimes it didn't even last until the end of the month. In the refrigerator, the empty spaces told stories of hard choices. Art doesn't fill the stomach, Maddie, her father would say, with the rough voice of someone who knew well the weight of the world. You need to study something that gives you security. Even when her high school teacher showed her parents their daughter's exceptional drawings and talked about scholarships in art schools, the response was the same. We can't take risks. She needs a secure future. And so Alyssa followed the path of security. She worked at a diner after school to pay for her business administration course. During college, her notebooks had more drawings in the margins than notes, but she persisted, swallowing the lump in her throat every time she passed by an art exhibit. At 23, she got a job at StrataSync Innovations, a rising technology company. The office was in a glass building downtown with views of the river. It was all very clean, organized, and impersonal. Alyssa occupied a small desk in the financial department. Her job consisted of checking reports, feeding spreadsheets, and attending endless meetings where she had to pretend to be interested. In the beginning, she still drew. She kept a notepad in her bag, and during lunch, sat in the building's garden and sketched what she saw: the flight of birds, the clouds changing shape, the profile of a stranger. That's how she met Samuel. Samuel Boyd had been the building's janitor for more than 20 years. A man in his early 60s with deep wrinkles around his eyes that became more pronounced when he smiled. He had large calloused hands and wore a flawlessly pressed gray uniform. One afternoon, while Alyssa was drawing, she felt a presence behind her. "You have the gift," he said in a hoarse yet gentle voice. It was the beginning of an unlikely friendship, the young administrator and the old janitor. During lunches, they shared stories. Samuel talked about Cora, his wife, who had passed away 5 years ago, how she painted on weekends, how she created a small studio in the basement of their house where she spent endless hours. She always said that painting was like breathing. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Samuel recounted, his eyes shining with longing. Alyssa in turn shared her stifled dreams, her drawings stored in folders, her secret desire to live from art. Samuel listened to her attentively as if every word was important. The years passed, StrataSync Innovations grew, and Alyssa survived several restructurings. Her salary increased, but her satisfaction decreased. Time to draw became increasingly scarce. Her boss, Darren Kessler, was the kind of man who thrived on power. He criticized publicly, praised rarely, and in private. Alyssa became his favorite target, perhaps because she never fought back, perhaps because her eyes, even after years of corporate work, still held a sparkle that annoyed him. Alyssa's desk was now filled with sticky notes, deadlines, numbers that needed to be reconciled. Her sketchbook started to gather dust in the drawer. Samuel noticed the change. In the rare moments when they still talked, he saw how her shoulders were increasingly slumped, how her smile took longer to appear. "Life is too short for regrets, Maddie," he would say, looking at her with concern. Cora discovered that too late, but Alyssa just smiled sadly. "Some people have the luxury of following dreams, Samuel. Others need to pay bills." On a rainy Tuesday in March, everything changed. The finance department was in an uproar early on. Rumors about a new round of layoffs were circulating like the wind. Darren called a general meeting at 10 a.m. Alyssa had a bad feeling, but ignored it. She was competent, punctual, never missed a day. Surely she would be safe. The meeting room was crowded. The glass walls allowed other employees to observe from outside. Darren entered with his usual arrogant demeanor, followed by 2 people from the Human Resources Department. As you all know, we are undergoing strategic changes. He began in a cold tone. We need to optimize our processes, and unfortunately, some positions have become redundant. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Alyssa. Miss Monroe, after a detailed review, we have concluded that your performance is not aligned with the company's objectives. Your contract will be terminated today. The ensuing silence was deafening. Alyssa felt as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water over her. Her face burned with embarrassment. Her hands trembled slightly. Around her, colleagues averted their eyes. Some whispered, the same people with whom she had shared coffees, lunches, concerns. You can collect your belongings now. HR has already prepared your documents. Darren concluded, already turning to discuss the next matter as if he had just mentioned the weather. Alyssa stood up on shaky legs. The exit from the meeting room seemed to take an eternity. Each step was a monumental effort. On her desk, a cardboard box was already prepared. Mechanically, she began to pack her belongings. Picture frames, pens, a small plant, the forgotten drawing pad. Carrying the box, she walked down the main corridor towards the elevator. Employees watched her with a mix of pity and relief. Relief that it wasn't them. It was then that she saw Samuel in the corner of the corridor pushing his cleaning cart. Their eyes met. She tried to force a smile, but her lips quivered. Samuel approached, his expression serious and determined. Silently, he extended his wrinkled hand. In the center of his palm rested a small, slightly oxidized golden key. "It's time," he whispered. His eyes filled with calm certainty. Confused, Alyssa asked, "Time for what, Samuel?" "To breathe, Maddie," as Cora used to say. He took a piece of paper from his pocket where he had written down an address. Willow Lane, number 58. Cora's studio has been waiting for you for too long. Confused, Alyssa took the key. Samuel explained that years ago, his late wife had a small studio, but he never had the courage to sell or dismantle it. The space, a small room next to his house, had been empty for a long time. That night, after hours of crying in her small apartment, Alyssa drove to the address. It was a simple house in the suburbs with a well-kept garden. The number 58 was inscribed on a wooden plaque at the entrance. The key fit perfectly into the lock. It was a small room that had been converted into a studio. Tall windows allowed natural light to enter. There were easels covered with sheets, shelves with dried paint pots, brushes forgotten in jars. Blank canvases leaned against the walls. There were also some fabrics, a sewing machine. Samuel's wife was an artist. She did many things. The smell was a mix of dust, oil paint, and memories. In the center, a large work table with a letter. Dear Alyssa, Cora always said that the studio had a special energy, that the walls absorbed creativity and returned it multiplied. Since she left, this place has been empty, waiting. When I saw you drawing on that first day, I knew that Cora would have loved to meet you. You share the same light in your eyes when you create. This space is now yours. It's not charity, it's recognition of your talent, your spirit, the artist you've always been, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. Life is too short to live someone else's dream. Samuel, she walked through the studio, touching the surfaces, feeling the energy of the place. On impulse, she removed one of the sheets, revealing an old but sturdy easel. She found a pad of paper in a drawer and a case of charcoal that still seemed usable. And then, as if something inside her had awakened from a long sleep, she felt an immense desire to draw. In the following months, Alyssa delved headlong into transforming the studio. The space, once dusty and neglected, now came alive in her hands. Each brush stroke was like a breath, a rediscovery of the passion that had always been there, but had been silenced by the demands of adult life. Initially, she painted for herself, as if each canvas was an intimate conversation between her and her own heart, an attempt to reclaim something that seemed lost. But with each canvas she filled, fear still accompanied her, like a silent shadow, waiting for the right moment to appear. With the severance money and what she had saved over the years, Alyssa managed to support herself and invest in her art. The fear of failing, of investing everything in a dream and having nothing to offer in return, was deeply rooted in her. It was the same fear that had accompanied her since childhood, when her family faced financial difficulties and dreams were just luxuries they couldn't afford. Even in the silence of the studio, with colors spreading across the canvases, she felt the weight of insecurity, as if every choice was a risky bet, and yet something inside her refused to give up. Even in the face of doubt, she knew it was time to take a risk, but the fear of returning to square one, of not being able to support herself, was still an obstacle to overcome. She maintained her friendship with Samuel. He encouraged her, invited friends to see her works, and promoted her work among acquaintances. The first painting she sold was to Samuel's niece, who wanted a portrait of her newborn son. The payment was modest, but the feeling that someone valued her art enough to pay for it was indescribable. Orders grew, and with them her confidence. She started paying rent to Samuel, even though he tried to refuse. She reimagined that place, which was so dear to his wife, and it had life once again. In 6 months, Alyssa already had a small loyal clientele. She expanded to illustrations for children's books, then to murals in local cafes. She created an online page to showcase her portfolio. Orders increased. Over time, she had to hire an assistant to help with the administrative part. The studio came to life again. Alyssa replaced the old paints, renovated the walls, and installed better lighting, but she kept the essence of the space, respecting Cora's memory. On a special shelf, she placed a picture of her found among the studio's belongings, a middle-aged woman smiling in front of a canvas with brushes in her hand and paint on her fingers. 2 years after being laid off, Alyssa lived solely from her art, and for the first time in her life she felt complete. Her name was starting to be recognized in the regional art circuit. One day she received an unexpected call. A children's book publisher wanted to close a significant deal with her for her to illustrate various books. She seemed unable to believe it. With all this happening, Alyssa was working on a special piece. For weeks, she dedicated herself to it in the intervals between orders. It was a double portrait based on an old yellowed photograph she had found hidden in a drawer in the studio. In the photo, a young Samuel and Cora, perhaps in their 40s, smiled at the camera in front of a lake. Alyssa carefully studied the faces, the smiles, the light in their eyes. Then she adapted the image. In her painting, Samuel and Cora were older, with white hair, their wrinkles more pronounced, but the same sparkle in their eyes, as if they had aged together, as they should have if fate had not had other plans. On an ordinary day, she called Samuel to show him her new works, and he went proudly like a father. Alyssa led him to a reserved room where the special painting was covered by a cloth. "I have something for you," she said, removing the cloth. Samuel stood motionless in front of the canvas, his eyes filled with tears as he gazed at the portrait. He and Cora growing old together in an alternate world where she was still by his side. "How?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I found a picture of you too. The rest was imagination and gratitude." Alyssa held his hand. "You gave me much more than a studio, Samuel. You gave me courage." Samuel, a man of few words, but always with great wisdom, said to the young woman, "Life is too short for regrets, Maddie. The right doors open at the right time, but it's up to us to have the courage to walk through them." And Alyssa, looking at her brightly lit studio, at her paint-stained hands, at the fulfilling life she had built, could not help but agree. She was ready to live intensely, and above all, she had learned not to let fear prevent her from doing what truly mattered. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.